When Captain Elena Ghost Vasquez's F-16 was shot down over enemy territory 10 years ago, the military held a funeral with full honors for their most decorated female pilot. What they didn't know was that she was very much alive working the night shift as an aircraft refueler at Davis Regional Airport, watching newer pilots take off in disguise. She once ruled, "Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work." So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The fluorescent lights of the fuel depot cast harsh shadows across Elena's weathered face as she completed her final inspection of the refueling truck. At 38, her hands moved with the same precision that had once guided a fighter jet through impossible maneuvers, though now they smelled of aviation fuel instead of victory. The small civilian airport in Nevada's high desert was a far cry from the military air bases where she'd once been legend, but it offered something she desperately needed after crawling out of that wreckage in Afghanistan. Invisibility. Elena pulled her baseball cap lower over her eyes as she watched the morning crew arrive. She preferred the solitude of the graveyard shift, when the only sounds were the distant hum of runway lights and the occasional cargo plane making late-night deliveries. Most of the day shift workers barely acknowledged her existence, which suited her perfectly. She'd spent 2 years perfecting the art of being unremarkable, of blending into the background while fighting the constant urge to correct every aviation mistake she witnessed. The transition from celebrated fighter pilot to anonymous fuel truck operator hadn't happened overnight. After the crash that officially killed Captain Elena Vasquez, the woman who crawled away from the wreckage had made a choice that would haunt her for years. Instead of signaling for rescue, she'd walked deeper into the mountains, eventually finding her way to a remote village where her injuries were treated by locals who asked no questions. The official search and rescue operation had lasted 3 weeks before declaring her body unrecoverable, lost somewhere in the unforgiving terrain of the Afghan highlands. Elena had watched the news coverage of her own memorial service from a hospital bed thousands of miles away, using forged documents and a new identity she'd purchased from contacts in the intelligence community. The woman on the screen receiving posthumous honors bore little resemblance to the hollow-eyed survivor who decided that Captain Elena Vasquez needed to stay dead. The reasons were complicated, buried in classified operations and political decisions that had left her questioning everything she'd once believed about duty and honor. Working at Davis Regional meant staying close to aviation without the weight of command decisions that could cost lives. She knew every aircraft that used the facility, could identify engine problems by sound alone, and had an encyclopedic knowledge of flight patterns and weather conditions that impressed even veteran pilots. But Elena Vasquez, the fuel truck operator, was careful to keep her expertise subtle, offering just enough insight to be helpful without drawing attention to the depth of her knowledge. The morning supervisor, Rick Martinez, had hired her 18 months ago based on impeccable references that were completely fabricated and a skill set that seemed impossibly comprehensive for someone claiming to be a career aviation support worker. Elena had crafted her background carefully: former Air Force logistics, honorable discharge, family obligations that required civilian employment. The story was believable enough to satisfy human resources while explaining her unusual familiarity with military aircraft procedures. "Morning, Elena," called out Sarah Chun, one of the few day shift workers who bothered to acknowledge the night crew. Sarah worked in air traffic control and had developed a professional respect for Elena's uncanny ability to predict aircraft behavior and spot potential safety issues before they became problems. That Gulfstream from last night left a nice commendation for the fuel service. Said it was the most professional operation they'd encountered at a regional facility. Elena nodded appreciatively while internally cringing at the attention. Commendations meant questions, and questions led to scrutiny she couldn't afford. She'd learned to calibrate her performance carefully, competent enough to keep the job, exceptional enough to ensure aircraft safety, but never so outstanding as to attract the kind of notice that might trigger background investigations. Irony wasn't lost on her that she was hiding in plain sight at an airport that regularly hosted military training flights. Twice a month, formations of F-16s would use Davis Regional for touch-and-go practice, their engines screaming overhead. As Elena watched from the ground, each time, she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came from watching precision flying, mixed with the bitter knowledge that those pilots were living the life she'd abandoned. During quiet moments between fuel deliveries, Elena would study the tactical approaches the training pilots used, mentally critiquing their techniques, while remembering her own days as an instructor at the Air Force's elite fighter weapons school. She'd been known as Ghost, not just for her ability to appear and disappear in combat situations, but for her almost supernatural understanding of air-to-air tactics and her uncanny skill at reading enemy intentions before they became actions. Other night shift workers knew Elena as someone who kept to herself but could be counted on in emergencies. When a small cargo plane had experienced hydraulic failure 3 months earlier, she'd been the one to talk the pilot through the emergency landing procedures while emergency crews scrambled to respond. Her calm professionalism during the crisis had earned respect throughout the airport, though she'd been careful to frame her knowledge as something I picked up during my Air Force days rather than revealing the true depth of her expertise. Elena's apartment above the airport's maintenance facility was spartanly furnished but filled with aviation magazines and technical manuals she studied religiously. Staying current with developments in fighter aviation was both a professional necessity and a personal compulsion. She needed to know how warfare had evolved since her official death, partly for security reasons and partly because some habits die harder than others. The most dangerous moments came when she recognized faces from her former life. Military aviation was a small community, and Davis Regional's proximity to Nellis Air Force Base meant that former colleagues occasionally passed through the facility. Elena had perfected the art of making herself invisible during such visits, but each encounter reminded her that her carefully constructed new identity was only as strong as her ability to avoid recognition. Late one night, while refueling a military transport aircraft, she'd overheard 2 pilots discussing tactics for a mission profile she'd helped develop years earlier. The urge to offer improvements to their approach had been almost overwhelming, but Elena had forced herself to focus on the mechanical task of fuel delivery, while listening to them plan operations that would have benefited enormously from her strategic input. The weight of her deception extended beyond professional frustration. Elena had left behind not just a career, but relationships, friendships, and a sister who still visited her grave every year on the anniversary of the crash. Sometimes, during the loneliest hours of the night shift, she wondered if the price of her freedom had been too high. But then she would remember the circumstances that had forced her to choose between truth and survival, and the decision would seem inevitable all over again. Working the fuel truck also gave Elena a unique perspective on civilian aviation operations. She'd developed an almost maternal protectiveness toward the pilots who used Davis Regional, especially the younger ones who reminded her of students she'd once trained. When she spotted potential safety issues, improper pre-flight procedures, questionable weather decisions, mechanical problems that less experienced eyes might miss, she found ways to ensure the information reached the appropriate people without drawing attention to herself. The airport's management considered Elena their most reliable employee, someone who showed up early, stayed late when needed, and maintained equipment with obsessive attention to detail. What they didn't realize was that her perfectionism came from years of military training where attention to detail meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. In her world, there had been no margin for error, and civilian life hadn't diminished her commitment to excellence. As the sun began to rise over the Nevada desert, Elena completed her shift paperwork with the same methodical precision she'd once applied to mission planning. Another 8 hours of invisibility. Another day of suppressing the pilot who still lived somewhere deep inside the fuel truck operator. She gathered her things slowly, reluctant to end the solitude that came with night work, knowing that tomorrow would bring another shift of careful anonymity in a world where she'd once been a legend. The morning crew was arriving as Elena prepared to leave, their casual chatter about weekend plans and family obligations, a reminder of the normal life she'd chosen over the extraordinary one she'd abandoned. As she walked toward her apartment, Elena caught sight of a formation of F-16s approaching from the east, their engines creating the distinctive sound that had once meant home. For just a moment, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like to be Ghost, the pilot who'd owned the sky. Then she pulled her cap down lower and disappeared into another day of being no one special. The morning briefing room at Davis Regional Airport buzzed with unusual tension as word spread that Colonel Marcus Blackwood would be arriving within the hour. The newly appointed commander of the Western Regional Training Command had a reputation that preceded him like a storm front, brilliant, demanding, and utterly intolerant of what he considered substandard operations. Airport manager Janet Williams paced nervously between the coffee machine and the window, checking her watch every few minutes while reviewing the facility inspection checklist for the 20th time. Elena had planned to head home after her shift ended, but the commotion in the main terminal caught her attention. Through the large windows of the operations center, she could see ground crews scurrying to ensure every piece of equipment was positioned perfectly, every surface cleaned to military standards. The sight triggered memories of similar preparations she'd witnessed countless times before important visits from senior leadership, though in those days she'd been on the other side of such inspections. All civilian personnel need to maintain professional appearance and demeanor during the colonel's visit, announced Tom Bradley, the airport's operations director, his voice carrying across the terminal. This inspection will determine whether Davis Regional continues to receive military training contracts, which represent 30% of our annual revenue. Colonel Blackwood has the authority to redirect those contracts to facilities that better meet his standards. Elena lingered near the fuel depot, ostensibly checking inventory levels while actually observing the preparations with professional interest. She'd encountered officers like Blackwood throughout her military career, leaders who equated perfection with competence and viewed any deviation from their standards as evidence of systemic failure. Such commanders often achieved impressive results through sheer force of will, but they also created environments where subordinates were afraid to voice concerns or offer alternative perspectives. The sound of rotor blades announced Blackwood's arrival before his helicopter appeared over the desert horizon. Elena watched the UH-60 Black Hawk execute a textbook approach, noting the pilot's precise control inputs and the crew's coordinated movements during the landing sequence. Even from a distance, she could assess the professionalism of the flight crew and predict the kind of operational standards their commander would expect from everyone else. Colonel Blackwood emerged from the aircraft with the bearing of someone accustomed to immediate compliance and unquestioning respect. Tall and lean with silver hair and penetrating gray eyes, he surveyed the airport facility with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating territory. His uniform was immaculate, his posture rigid, and his expression suggested that he'd already identified multiple deficiencies that would require correction. The welcoming committee included Janet Williams, Tom Bradley, and several department heads, all of whom had clearly rehearsed their presentations multiple times. Elena observed their nervous energy and forced smiles from her position near the fuel trucks, recognizing the psychological dynamics that occurred when lower-ranking personnel encountered senior officers known for their exacting standards. Mr. Bradley, Blackwood's voice carried clearly across the tarmac as he began his initial assessment. I trust you've prepared comprehensive documentation regarding your facility's safety protocols, maintenance procedures, and personnel qualifications. My evaluation will be thorough, and I expect complete transparency regarding any deficiencies or irregularities in your operations. The formal inspection began with a review of administrative procedures, during which Blackwood methodically examined everything from pilot certification records to equipment maintenance logs. Elena continued her work routine while keeping one ear on the proceedings, noting how the colonel's questions revealed both extensive knowledge and an expectation that everyone else would demonstrate comparable expertise. These maintenance records show adequate attention to routine procedures, Blackwood observed while reviewing aircraft service documentation. But I notice a lack of detailed analysis regarding predictive maintenance protocols. How do you identify potential equipment failures before they become safety hazards? Tom Bradley launched into a prepared explanation about their preventive maintenance schedule, but Elena could tell from his hesitant tone that he wasn't entirely comfortable with the technical details. The airport relied heavily on contracted maintenance services for complex repairs, and most of the management team had limited hands-on experience with aircraft systems. As the inspection progressed through different areas of the facility, Elena noticed that Blackwood's questions were becoming increasingly specific and technical. He wasn't simply verifying compliance with regulations. He was testing the depth of knowledge and competence throughout the organization. This approach would inevitably expose gaps in expertise that might not affect day-to-day operations, but could become critical during emergency situations. The moment that would define the entire inspection came when Blackwood's attention turned to fuel handling procedures. Elena had been hoping to avoid direct interaction with the visiting colonel, but her position as the senior fuel technician made that impossible when he began examining the refueling operations in detail. I want to speak with whoever supervises your fuel quality control procedures, Blackwood announced, consulting his inspection checklist. Fuel contamination has been responsible for more training accidents than any other single factor, and I need assurance that your protocols meet military aviation standards. Tom Bradley gestured toward Elena with obvious reluctance, clearly wishing he could delegate this interaction to someone with more formal credentials. Colonel, this is Elena Martinez, our lead fuel technician. She handles all quality control procedures and has maintained perfect safety records since joining our team. Elena approached the group with careful neutrality, neither eager to impress nor obviously reluctant to participate. She'd learned to project competence without enthusiasm, expertise without ambition. Blackwood studied her with the same calculating assessment he'd applied to every other aspect of the facility, noting her worn work clothes, weathered hands, and the subtle confidence in her posture. Ms. Martinez, Blackwood began, his tone suggesting that he expected to find the same gaps in knowledge that had characterized his other interactions. Walk me through your fuel testing procedures. I want specific details about contamination, detection, additive verification, and quality documentation. Elena launched into a comprehensive explanation of their fuel analysis protocols, describing each step with technical precision while demonstrating equipment operation and showing sample documentation. She covered everything from water contamination detection to fuel additive chemistry, explaining how different environmental conditions could affect fuel quality and what precautions were necessary to prevent contamination. During storage and transfer, Blackwood's expression shifted subtly as Elena's explanation continued. Her knowledge was not only comprehensive but nuanced, reflecting understanding that typically came from extensive training and real-world experience with fuel-related problems. She discussed technical specifications with the fluency of someone who'd dealt with fuel systems under demanding conditions, not simply someone who'd memorized procedures from a manual. Your protocols appear adequate, Blackwood conceded, though. His tone suggested surprise at finding such expertise in what he'd expected to be a routine civilian operation. Where did you acquire this level of technical knowledge? Most civilian facilities rely on contracted specialists for this depth of fuel system analysis. Elena had prepared for this question, knowing that her expertise would inevitably draw attention from anyone with sufficient knowledge to recognize it. Air Force logistics training, sir. 8 years working with fuel systems on various aircraft types before transitioning to civilian employment for family reasons. The explanation was partially truthful while omitting crucial details about her actual role and the level of responsibility she'd held. Fighter pilots received extensive training in fuel system operations as part of their overall aircraft systems knowledge, but Elena was careful to frame her background in terms that suggested support functions rather than operational flying experience. Blackwood made notes on his inspection form while studying Elena with increased interest. Something about her demeanor and knowledge base didn't quite align with the background she'd provided, but he couldn't identify specific inconsistencies. Military logistics personnel could indeed acquire comprehensive fuel systems expertise, and her explanation was plausible enough to satisfy official requirements. I'll need to review your personnel file and training certifications, Blackwood informed Tom Bradley while maintaining eye contact with Elena. Quality control procedures are only as reliable as the people implementing them, and I want verification that your technical staff meets military standards for fuel handling operations. Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with increased scrutiny. Her fabricated credentials would withstand routine background checks, but military personnel files included details that could trigger deeper investigations if someone with sufficient access decided to dig deeper. Blackwood struck her as exactly the kind of meticulous leader who might pursue inconsistencies until he found satisfactory answers. The remainder of the inspection proceeded without additional focus on Elena, but she remained acutely aware of Blackwood's occasional glances in her direction. He'd identified something that didn't quite fit his expectations, and officers with his reputation rarely ignored such instincts. The professional relationship between Davis Regional and the Military Training Command would continue, but Elena sensed that her carefully maintained anonymity might have sustained its first serious crackdown as Blackwood prepared to depart. He gathered the management team for final comments and recommendations. His assessment had been generally favorable, noting the facility's adequate safety procedures and acceptable maintenance standards, but he'd also identified areas requiring improvement and closer oversight. Most significantly, he'd decided that future training operations would include periodic unannounced inspections to ensure continued compliance with military standards. Effective immediately, Blackwood announced, Davis Regional will host monthly training exercises involving advanced tactical scenarios. These operations will require enhanced security protocols and closer coordination between civilian staff and military personnel. I expect full cooperation and professional standards that reflect the critical nature of our training missions. Elena watched the colonel's helicopter disappear into the desert sky while processing the implications of his announcement. Monthly training exercises meant regular exposure to military personnel who might recognize her from her previous life. Enhanced security protocols could trigger more thorough background investigations of civilian employees with access to sensitive operations. The carefully constructed buffer between Elena Martinez and Captain Elena Vasquez was about to become significantly thinner. As the inspection team dispersed and normal operations resumed, Elena returned to her fuel truck with growing awareness that her anonymous existence was entering a more dangerous phase. Colonel Blackwood represented exactly the kind of systematic, detail-oriented leadership that could uncover secrets buried beneath layers of careful deception. His monthly training exercises would bring her face-to-face with the aviation community she'd left behind, testing her ability to remain invisible while working alongside people who might remember. Ghost. The first monthly training exercise arrived 3 weeks later with the subtlety of a desert sandstorm. Elena watched from the fuel depot as a convoy of military vehicles rolled through the main gate, followed by transport aircraft carrying personnel and equipment that transformed Davis Regional from a quiet civilian airport into a bustling military operations center. Colonel Blackwood had made good on his promise to integrate the facility into advanced tactical training, and the changes were immediately apparent to anyone familiar with military protocol. Elena had spent those 3 weeks refining her strategies for avoiding recognition while maintaining her job responsibilities. She'd studied personnel rosters posted in the operations center, memorizing names and faces of incoming military staff to identify anyone who might pose a risk. Most concerning was the presence of several pilots from Nellis Air Force Base, including some who'd been stationed there during her active duty years. The likelihood of encountering someone from her past was no longer theoretical, it was inevitable. The training scenario involved complex air-to-ground coordination exercises that required precise fuel management and rapid aircraft turnaround times. Elena found herself working longer hours to support the increased operational tempo, but the demanding schedule also provided opportunities to demonstrate competence without drawing unwanted attention. Military personnel appreciated efficiency and professionalism, traits that allowed her to blend into the background while ensuring their missions proceeded smoothly. Captain David Torres, the training exercise coordinator, had established a command post in the airport's main conference room, where tactical planning sessions occurred throughout the day. Elena could overhear fragments of conversation as she passed the room during fuel deliveries, and the familiar terminology triggered muscle memory from her days as a mission planner. She found herself unconsciously analyzing their tactical approaches and identifying potential improvements, though she was careful to keep such observations to herself. The first serious test of her anonymity came on Wednesday morning when she was assigned to refuel a flight of F-16 Fighting Falcons that had just completed a training sortie. As Elena approached the aircraft with her fuel truck, she immediately recognized the lead pilot climbing down from the cockpit. Lieutenant Colonel Jake Morrison had been a fellow instructor at the Fighter Weapons School during her final year of active duty, and he'd been present at several classified briefings where her tactical innovations had been discussed in detail. Elena pulled her cap low and focused on the mechanical aspects of fuel transfer while Morrison conducted his post-flight inspection nearby. She could hear him debriefing with his wingman about the morning's exercise, discussing engagement tactics and lessons learned with the kind of detailed analysis that characterized professional fighter pilots. His voice carried the same confident authority she remembered, and several times he glanced in her direction with the casual curiosity of someone trying to place a familiar face. "Fuel service is exceptionally professional here," Morrison commented to his wingman while Elena completed the refueling procedure with practiced efficiency. Whoever trained their ground crew understood military standards. Most civilian facilities can't match this level of precision. Elena acknowledged the compliment with a professional nod while internally calculating the risk of extended interaction. Morrison's compliment suggested that her military background was showing through her civilian disguise, which could be either beneficial or dangerous depending on how much attention it attracted. She finished the fuel transfer quickly and moved to service the wingman's aircraft, hoping to minimize the duration of her exposure. The second aircraft required additional maintenance attention due to a minor hydraulic leak that Elena spotted during her routine inspection. Fighter aircraft hydraulic systems were complex and potentially dangerous if not properly addressed, and her training had ingrained automatic responses to such problems. Without thinking, she documented the issue with technical precision that would have impressed any military maintenance officer. "Ma'am," called Morrison's wingman, First Lieutenant Sarah Kim, "you found that hydraulic leak faster than our crew." "Chief usually does. Have you worked on F-16 systems before?" Elena realized she'd made a tactical error by demonstrating expertise that exceeded reasonable expectations for civilian fuel technicians. Her knowledge of F-16 hydraulic systems came from years of flying the aircraft and understanding every component that could affect flight safety. But explaining that level of familiarity would require more deception than she was comfortable with. Air Force maintenance background, Elena replied, using her standard explanation while hoping it would satisfy Kim's curiosity. Once you've seen enough hydraulic leaks, they all start to look the same. I just documented what I observed for your maintenance crew to evaluate. Morrison approached as Elena was completing her documentation, and she could sense his professional interest in her technical assessment. Fighter pilots developed strong relationships with maintenance personnel who demonstrated competence and attention to detail, and Elena's performance was clearly exceeding his expectations for civilian support. Staff, your leak assessment is spot on, Morrison said, reviewing Elena's documentation. Most ground crew would have missed the early warning signs of that seal failure. Where did you serve in the Air Force? The question Elena had been dreading finally arrived, posed by someone with sufficient knowledge and access to potentially verify her fabricated background. Morrison wasn't asking out of casual curiosity. He was demonstrating the kind of professional interest that could lead to deeper investigation if she couldn't provide satisfactory answers. Various assignments in logistics and fuel systems, Elena responded, maintaining eye contact while providing information that was technically accurate but deliberately vague. Mostly working behind the scenes to keep aircraft flying. Nothing as exciting as what you pilots do. Morrison smiled at what he interpreted as appropriate modesty from support personnel, but Elena could see that her non-specific answer hadn't fully satisfied his curiosity. Fighter pilots were accustomed to working with highly skilled technical specialists, and they developed instincts for recognizing unusual competence even when it appeared in unexpected contexts. The conversation was interrupted by Captain Torres announcing over the radio that afternoon training flights would be delayed due to weather conditions developing over the practice range. Elena seized the opportunity to excuse herself and return to the fuel depot, but not before overhearing Morrison mention to Kim that something about the fuel technician seemed familiar, though he couldn't place exactly what that afternoon brought. The kind of crisis that Elena had been both expecting and dreading since Blackwood's training exercises began. A severe thunderstorm system moved through the area faster than weather forecasters had predicted, creating dangerous conditions for aircraft still conducting training missions. Elena watched the radar displays in the operations center and immediately recognized that several flights would need to return to base urgently to avoid hazardous weather. The problem became apparent when two F-16s approached the airport simultaneously, both low on fuel and racing ahead of the storm system. The air traffic controller was managing multiple aircraft arrivals while coordinating with range control to account for training flights still airborne. Elena could see that the fuel management situation was becoming critical with insufficient time for normal refueling procedures if both aircraft were to depart before the storm arrived. From her position near the fuel trucks, Elena watched the tactical situation develop with growing concern. The lead aircraft had enough fuel to reach an alternate airfield if necessary, but the wingman was approaching minimum fuel levels that would require immediate refueling regardless of weather conditions. Standard procedures called for sequential aircraft handling, but Elena could see that timeline would leave the second pilot with dangerous fuel margins. Elena's fighter pilot instincts kicked in as she mentally calculated fuel consumption rates, weather timeline, and optimal handling procedures that could safely service both aircraft before the storm reached the airport. The solution required coordinating fuel truck positioning and streamlining refueling procedures in ways that weren't covered in standard civilian operations manuals, but were routine for military personnel who understood the tactical implications of fuel management under time pressure. "Tower, this is Viper 2, came the voice of the fuel-critical aircraft over the radio. "I'm showing 1,500 pounds of fuel remaining. I need immediate service upon landing, or I'll have to declare an emergency and divert to alternate field. Elena realized that the civilian ground crew wasn't prepared for the kind of rapid aircraft handling that the situation required. They were competent professionals, but they lacked experience with military urgency protocols that could make the difference between routine operations and emergency conditions. Without intervention, the second pilot would either risk running out of fuel or be forced to divert to a distant airfield, disrupting training schedules and potentially creating additional complications. Elena made a decision that she knew would expose her expertise, but was necessary to prevent a dangerous situation from escalating into an actual emergency. She approached the ground crew supervisor and offered to coordinate the rapid refueling procedures, explaining that her Air Force background included experience with time-critical fuel operations. If we position both fuel trucks simultaneously and use dual-point refueling procedures, Elena explained to the supervisor, we can service both aircraft and have them airborne before the weather arrives. It requires precise coordination, but it's a standard procedure for tactical operations. The supervisor, overwhelmed by the developing situation and grateful for any assistance, authorized Elena to coordinate the refueling operation. As the two F-16s landed in quick succession, Elena directed the ground crew with the kind of confident authority that came from years of managing similar situations under pressure. Her instructions were precise, her timing was perfect, and her understanding of pilot requirements was comprehensive. Morrison and Kim quickly recognized that the refueling operation was being managed with military efficiency that exceeded anything they'd experienced at civilian facilities. Elena's coordination of equipment positioning, crew assignments, and safety protocols demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking that typically came from officer-level training rather than enlisted maintenance experience. Outstanding fuel service. Morrison radioed to the tower as both aircraft completed refueling and prepared for immediate departure. Ground crew coordination was textbook perfect. Someone down there knows exactly what they're doing. As the F-16s departed ahead of the approaching storm, Elena realized that her intervention had been successful in preventing a potential emergency, but at the cost of revealing capabilities that would inevitably generate questions about her background and training. Morrison and Kim had witnessed tactical expertise that didn't match her claimed logistics experience, and their professional curiosity would likely lead to further inquiry. Captain Torres approached Elena as the ground crew secured equipment before the storm's arrival, his expression mixing gratitude with puzzlement. "That was impressive coordination," he said. "I've seen similar procedures at fighter bases, but never executed so smoothly by civilian personnel. Your Air Force experience must have been more extensive than your personnel file indicates." Elena felt the familiar weight of deception as she navigated Torres's observation without providing information that could trigger deeper investigation. Each demonstration of competence that exceeded expectations created additional pressure to explain capabilities that couldn't be truthfully acknowledged without revealing her true identity. The thunderstorm arrived with the fury that desert weather systems could unleash, bringing high winds and heavy rain that effectively ended flying operations for the remainder of the day. As Elena secured the fuel depot and prepared to weather the storm, she reflected on how the afternoon's crisis had forced her further into the open than she'd intended. The successful coordination of emergency refueling procedures had demonstrated tactical expertise that would be difficult to explain through fabricated logistics background, especially to military personnel who understood the difference between technical knowledge and operational experience. The storm had passed by evening, leaving the desert air crisp and clear under a canopy of stars that reminded Elena of night missions she'd flown over similar terrain years ago. As she completed her shift paperwork in the fuel depot office, she could hear voices from the temporary military command post where Officers were conducting after-action reviews of the day's training exercises. The successful fuel operations during the weather emergency had become a talking point, with several pilots specifically commenting on the moment exceptional coordination they'd witnessed. Elena was preparing to secure the facility for the night when Captain Torres appeared at her office door, accompanied by Lieutenant Colonel Morrison and a woman in Air Force uniform whom Elena didn't recognize. The formal nature of their approach immediately put her on alert. This wasn't a casual conversation about fuel procedures, but something that required official attention. "Ms. Martinez," Torres began, his tone respectfully professional, "I'd like you to meet Major Lisa Chun from the Air Force Safety Center. She's here to document best practices from today's emergency fuel operations for potential implementation at other training facilities." Major Chun stepped forward with the confident bearing of an officer accustomed to conducting official inquiries. Elena recognized the type: intelligent, thorough, and experienced in extracting information from personnel who might not be entirely forthcoming about their backgrounds or capabilities. Chun's presence suggested that Elena's afternoon performance had attracted attention from higher levels of command. "Ms. Martinez," Chun said, extending her hand, "Captain Torres and Lieutenant Colonel Morrison have provided remarkable testimony about your coordination of rapid refueling procedures under adverse conditions. I understand you managed to service 2 fuel-critical aircraft and launch them safely ahead of dangerous weather. That level of tactical efficiency typically requires specialized training." Elena accepted the handshake while mentally preparing for the kind of detailed questioning that could expose inconsistencies in her fabricated background. Chun's inquiry was ostensibly focused on documenting successful procedures, but Elena recognized the underlying assessment of her qualifications and potential security implications of civilian personnel demonstrating military-level expertise. "I was fortunate to have experienced ground crew and favorable circumstances," Elena replied, deflecting personal credit while acknowledging the successful outcome. "The procedures I suggested are standard military protocol for time-critical fuel operations. Any Air Force veteran with fuel systems experience would know similar techniques." Morrison interjected with the kind of technical specificity that Elena had been hoping to avoid. "Ma'am, with respect, what you coordinated went beyond standard procedures. The dual-point refueling setup, crew positioning, and timing coordination showed tactical awareness that I've only seen from officers with operational experience. Most enlisted fuel specialists wouldn't think in terms of threat timelines and mission-critical decision-making." Elena felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in as her carefully constructed cover story encountered professional scrutiny from people qualified to recognize its limitations. Morrison's observation was accurate. Her tactical thinking had revealed officer-level training that was inconsistent with the enlisted logistics background she'd claimed. Each attempt to explain her capabilities risked creating additional inconsistencies that would trigger more detailed investigation. "Lieutenant Colonel Morrison raises an important point," Chun observed while consulting notes on her tablet. "The procedures you implemented required understanding of pilot fuel management protocols, weather-related decision matrices, and risk assessment frameworks that aren't typically covered in standard fuel technician training. Where did you acquire that level of operational knowledge?" Elena realized she was facing the kind of methodical interrogation that she'd conducted herself during her military career when investigating security concerns or unusual incidents. Chun was building a case for something that went beyond documenting best practices. She was attempting to understand how civilian personnel had acquired knowledge that could have security implications if obtained through unauthorized channels. "Major Chun," Elena said, choosing her words carefully, "my Air Force experience included working with flight operations personnel in various capacities. When you're responsible for fuel systems on a busy flight line, you learn to think like Pilots because your decisions affect their mission success. Over 8 years, that kind of exposure provides insights into operational procedures. Chun made additional notes while studying Elena with the calculating assessment of someone trained to detect deception. Elena's explanation was plausible, but vague, providing general justification for her knowledge without specific details that could be verified through official records. For someone conducting a security assessment, such evasiveness would be a red flag requiring further investigation. "I'd like to review your service record in detail," Chun announced, her request carrying the authority of an official investigation. The Air Force maintains comprehensive documentation of personnel assignments, training certifications, and security clearances. Your demonstrated expertise suggests involvement in classified or sensitive operations that should be reflected in your official file. Elena felt her pulse quicken as the conversation moved into territory that could expose her fabricated identity. Her fictional service record would withstand routine background checks, but detailed examination by someone with Chun's access and expertise could reveal inconsistencies that would trigger deeper investigation. The fictional Elena Martinez might have adequate credentials, but she wouldn't have the specific training that could explain tactical knowledge demonstrated during the afternoon's emergency. "Ma'am," Elena replied, maintaining steady eye contact despite her growing anxiety, "I'm happy to provide any documentation you require. My service record should reflect standard logistics assignments with various fuel systems responsibilities. I never claimed to have classified or sensitive training, just practical experience gained through routine duties." Torres, who had been observing the exchange with growing discomfort, attempted to diffuse the tension by focusing on operational rather than investigative concerns. "Major Chun, regardless of Miss Martinez's background, her performance today prevented what could have been a serious emergency. Perhaps we should concentrate on documenting her procedures rather than questioning her qualifications." Chun's response indicated that Torres's suggestion had missed the broader implications of the situation. "Captain Torres, I appreciate your operational perspective, but my responsibility extends beyond documenting procedures. When civilian personnel demonstrate capabilities that suggest access to restricted training or information, I'm required to investigate potential security concerns." Elena recognized that the conversation had crossed into formal investigation territory, where her responses could have legal as well as professional consequences. Chun was no longer documenting best practices. She was conducting a security assessment. That could lead to background investigations, polygraph examinations, and detailed scrutiny of Elena's entire fabricated identity. "Major Chun," Elena said, deciding that honesty about her concerns was preferable to continued evasion, "I understand your security responsibilities, and I'm willing to cooperate fully with any investigation you deem necessary. However, I want to be clear that my knowledge comes from legitimate Air Force training and experience, not from unauthorized sources or classified exposure." Morrison had been listening to the exchange with growing recognition that something significant was occurring beyond a routine documentation process. His fighter pilot instincts told him that Elena was more than she appeared, but he was also developing respect for her professionalism and obvious competence under pressure. "Major Chun," Morrison interjected, "I've worked with fuel specialists throughout my career, and I can tell you that Ms. Martinez demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking that would make her valuable in any operational environment. Whether her knowledge comes from enlisted experience or officer training, she clearly understands aviation operations at a level that benefits mission success." Elena appreciated Morrison's support while recognizing that his praise was actually strengthening Chun's case for investigation. Military officers didn't typically advocate for civilian personnel unless they recognized exceptional qualifications, and such recognition would inevitably lead to questions about how those qualifications had been acquired. Chun consulted her tablet again before addressing Elena with the formality that indicated official investigation procedures were being initiated. Ms. Martinez, I'm going to request a comprehensive review of your background and qualifications through official Air Force channels. This process typically takes several weeks and may require interviews with former supervisors and colleagues. Elena felt the floor shifting beneath her carefully constructed identity as Chun's investigation threatened to expose the fictional nature of her background. The Elena Martinez who appeared in Air Force records was a composite creation, based on legitimate personnel who'd served in similar capacities, but detailed investigation would eventually reveal that her specific service record was fabricated. "Ma'am," Elena replied, working to keep her voice steady, "I understand your requirements and I'll provide whatever cooperation is necessary. However, I hope you'll consider that my civilian employment here has been exemplary, and any security concerns should be balanced against my demonstrated reliability and professionalism." Torres attempted once more to redirect the conversation toward practical considerations rather than investigative procedures. "Major Chun, we have additional training exercises scheduled throughout the month. Ms. Martinez has proven invaluable for supporting military operations, and I'd hate to lose her services while administrative reviews are conducted." Chun's response indicated that security concerns would take precedence over operational convenience. "Captain Torres, I understand your operational needs, but if Ms. Martinez has access to classified procedures or information through unauthorized channels, that represents a security risk that must be addressed immediately. She remain in her current position pending investigation, but with restricted access to sensitive operations." Elena realized that Chun's restrictions would effectively prevent her from performing the fuel coordination duties that had attracted attention in the first place. The irony wasn't lost on her. By demonstrating exceptional competence, she'd triggered security concerns that would limit her ability to continue providing the same level of service that had impressed military personnel. "Major Chun," Elena said, accepting the inevitable while attempting to minimize the scope of investigation, "I want to emphasize that my technical knowledge comes entirely from legitimate sources and training. I've never had access to classified information through my civilian employment, and I've always maintained appropriate security protocols." As the meeting concluded with Chun scheduling follow-up interviews and Torres expressing concern about operational impacts, Elena understood that her carefully maintained anonymity was entering its final phase. Chun's investigation would eventually expose the fictional nature of her background, forcing Elena to choose between revealing her true identity or abandoning the life she'd built at Davis Regional. Walking back to her apartment after the others had departed, Elena reflected on how quickly circumstances could change when security concerns intersected with personal deception. She'd spent 2 years perfecting the art of competent invisibility, only to have one afternoon of tactical excellence trigger the kind of scrutiny that could destroy everything she'd worked to build. The desert night was quiet, except for the distant sound of aircraft conducting night training operations, their engines echoing off the mountains that surrounded the airport. Elena paused outside her apartment to listen to the familiar sounds of military aviation, wondering how much longer she would be able to hear them as Elena Martinez, rather than as someone whose true identity was about to be exposed through the same professional excellence that had once made her legendary. Tomorrow would bring Chun's formal investigation and the beginning of a process that would either force Elena to reveal who she really was or compel her to disappear once again into a new identity in a different place. Either way, the quiet fuel technician who had watched from the shadows while others flew the missions she'd once commanded was about to step back into the light, whether she was ready or not. The crisis began at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning, when Elena's emergency pager buzzed with the distinctive pattern that indicated a real-world emergency rather than a training exercise. She'd been lying awake anyway, her mind churning through possible responses to Major Chun's investigation, which had been quietly proceeding for 6 days with increasing intensity. The pager's urgent tone cut through her restless thoughts like a blade, demanding immediate attention to something far more pressing than administrative concerns. Elena grabbed her radio and switched to the emergency frequency, where she immediately heard the tension in air traffic controller Sarah Chun's voice as she coordinated multiple aircraft in what was clearly a developing crisis situation. The fragmented radio traffic painted a picture of confusion and urgency that triggered Elena's combat instincts even before she fully understood the nature of the emergency. Davis Tower, this is Eagle Flight. We have a pilot down approximately 40 miles northeast of your position. Last known coordinates grid 7-7-Alpha-Charlie-4-9. Pilot ejected from F-16 during night training exercise and is currently on the ground with unknown injuries. Weather conditions deteriorating rapidly with visibility dropping to less than half a mile. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena was already pulling on her work clothes as the radio traffic continued, but she could hear the mounting complications in the controller's voice as additional information revealed the scope of the problem. The downed pilot was Captain Rebecca Walsh, a relatively inexperienced aviator conducting her first night training mission in mountainous terrain. The ejection had occurred during adverse weather conditions that were rapidly worsening, making rescue operations extremely hazardous. Eagle Flight, be advised that search and rescue assets are currently committed to another emergency and won't be available for a minimum 2 hours. We're coordinating with civilian emergency services, but ground access to the crash site is limited due to terrain features and current weather conditions. Elena felt her stomach tighten as she processed the tactical situation. 2 hours was an eternity for an injured pilot on the ground in deteriorating weather conditions, especially one who might be suffering from ejection injuries or exposure. Mountain terrain in bad weather could be lethal even for healthy individuals, and a pilot who just experienced the trauma of emergency ejection would be particularly vulnerable. She arrived at the airport to find controlled chaos as military personnel established emergency coordination procedures while civilian staff struggled to support unfamiliar crisis protocols. Colonel Blackwood had been awakened and was en route to assume command of the rescue operation, but his estimated arrival time was still 45 minutes away. In the meantime, Captain Torres was attempting to coordinate resources that seemed inadequate for the developing emergency. The civilian helicopter service is grounded due to weather conditions, Torres explained to the assembled personnel, his frustration evident as he reviewed available options. Their pilots aren't certified for instrument flight in mountainous terrain during low visibility conditions. We're looking at ground rescue options, but the terrain between here and the crash site includes several ridge lines that would require technical climbing equipment. Elena listened to Torres's assessment while mentally calculating alternative approaches that weren't being considered. The crash site coordinates put Captain Walsh in terrain that she'd studied extensively during her own mountain flying training, and she knew there were potential helicopter landing zones that civilian rescue services might not be aware of. More importantly, she understood the specific challenges of flying rescue missions in mountainous terrain during adverse weather conditions. "Sir," Elena said, approaching Torres with the careful formality required when civilian personnel offered input during military operations, "I'm familiar with that terrain from my Air Force experience. There are potential landing sites that might be accessible to qualified pilots with mountain flying experience, even in current weather conditions." Torres looked up from his maps with the expression of someone grasping for any viable option in an increasingly desperate situation. "Ms. Martinez, civilian helicopter services have already determined that conditions are too dangerous for flight operations. Are you suggesting they're being overly cautious? Elena realized she was about to cross another line in her carefully maintained cover story. But Captain Walsh's life was more important than maintaining her fictional identity. The rescue required expertise that civilian services didn't possess, and knowledge that she couldn't share without revealing capabilities that exceeded her claimed background. Captain Torres, Elena said, choosing her words carefully. Mountain rescue operations require specific techniques and risk assessment, criteria that aren't covered in standard civilian training. The pilots who declined this mission were making responsible decisions based on their experience level. But that doesn't mean the mission is impossible for pilots with appropriate qualifications. Torres studied Elena with growing recognition that her knowledge was once again exceeding reasonable expectations for her claimed background. Ms. Martinez, are you saying you have experience with mountain rescue operations? Because if you do, I need to know about it immediately. Elena felt the familiar weight of deception as she navigated between the truth that could save Captain Walsh and the lies that protected her own identity. Each word she spoke was being evaluated, not just for its tactical value, but for its implications. Regarding her background and qualifications, "Sir, I have extensive knowledge of mountain flying operations from my Air Force experience," Elena replied, providing information that was technically accurate while remaining deliberately vague about the specific nature of that experience. "I understand the terrain, weather patterns, and tactical considerations involved in this type of rescue mission." Before Torres could respond with additional questions, the radio crackled with updated information that made the situation even more urgent. "Davis Tower, this is Eagle 2 conducting search pattern over crash site. We have visual contact with pilot survival beacon, but weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Pilot appears to be moving but may be injured. Cloud ceiling is dropping and we're approaching minimum safe altitude for continued operations." Elena realized that conventional rescue approaches were running out of time as weather conditions eliminated options that might have been viable earlier in the emergency. The downed pilot needed immediate extraction before exposure and potential injuries created life-threatening complications, but available resources lacked the specialized capabilities required for night rescue operations in mountainous terrain. During adverse weather, "Captain Torres," Elena said, making a decision that would irrevocably change her situation at Davis Regional, "I need to speak with you privately about additional options that might be available for this rescue operation." Torres gestured toward a quiet corner of the operations center where they could speak without being overheard by other personnel. Elena could see the desperation in his expression as he recognized that conventional resources were proving inadequate for the emergency, and she knew that her next words would either save Captain Walsh or expose Elena Martinez as someone other than who she claimed to be. "Sir," Elena began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal, "I have piloting experience that might be relevant to this rescue operation. If there's an available helicopter and authorization for civilian support, I might be able to reach Captain Walsh when other assets cannot." Torres stared at Elena with the expression of someone whose fundamental assumptions were being challenged by rapidly developing circumstances. "Ms. Martinez, are you telling me you're a qualified helicopter pilot? Because your personnel file shows logistics and fuel systems experience, not flight training." Elena realized that half-truths were no longer sufficient for the situation they were facing. Captain Walsh needed immediate rescue by someone with the skills to navigate dangerous terrain in adverse conditions, and Elena possessed those skills, even though revealing them would destroy her carefully constructed civilian identity. "Captain Torres," Elena said, abandoning the fictional limitations of Elena Martinez for the operational requirements of the emergency. "Unqualified on UH-60 Black Hawks with extensive experience in mountain rescue operations under adverse conditions. I can reach Captain Walsh if you can provide aircraft and authorization." Torres processed this revelation with the stunned expression of someone discovering that their assumptions about a colleague had been completely wrong. Elena's claim represented capabilities that would make her one of the most qualified rescue pilots in the region, but it also raised profound questions about why someone with such qualifications was working as a civilian fuel technician. "Ma'am," Torres said, his tone shifting to reflect Elena's revealed capabilities, "I need verification of your pilot qualifications before I can authorize emergency flight operations. Do you have current certifications and medical clearances for helicopter operations?" Elena had maintained her flight certifications in anticipation of exactly this kind of emergency, though she'd never expected to use them under such circumstances. "Sir, I have current FSA helicopter ratings and medical certification. My military experience includes combat rescue operations in terrain similar to what we're facing tonight." Torres was reaching for his radio to contact higher authority when Colonel Blackwood's voice cut through the operations center with the authority of someone assuming command of a critical situation. His helicopter had arrived ahead of schedule, and he was demanding immediate briefings on rescue progress and available options. "Captain Torres, report on current rescue status and available assets," Blackwood commanded as he strode into the operations center, his uniform crisp despite the early morning hour and emergency circumstances. "I need complete assessment of our capabilities and timeline for pilot extraction." Torres glanced at Elena with an expression that mixed gratitude for her revealed capabilities with concern about how to explain her unexpected qualifications to a colonel who had already demonstrated interest in her background. Elena realized that the next few minutes would determine not only whether she would be authorized to attempt Captain Walsh's rescue, but whether her true identity would be exposed to the one person most likely to recognize the legendary pilot known as Ghost. "Sir," Torres began, "we have a potential asset available for immediate rescue operations, but it involves civilian personnel with military helicopter experience. Ms. Martinez has revealed pilot qualifications that might enable her to reach Captain Walsh when other assets cannot." Blackwood's attention focused on Elena with the laser intensity of a commander evaluating critical information during an emergency. She could see him processing Torres's statement while simultaneously assessing her appearance, demeanor, and the implications of civilian personnel possessing capabilities that exceeded their documented backgrounds. "Ms. Martinez," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the weight of command authority, "explain your helicopter qualifications and assess your capability to conduct rescue operations in current weather conditions." Elena realized that her response would determine whether Captain Walsh lived or died, and whether Elena Martinez would continue to exist, or whether Captain Elena Vasquez would finally step out of the shadows to save the life of a fellow pilot. The moment of decision had arrived, and there was no more time for careful deception or protective anonymity. "Colonel Blackwood," Elena said, meeting his gaze directly while making the choice that would change everything, "I'm qualified and current on UH-60 operations with over 2,000 hours, including combat rescue missions in Afghanistan. I can reach Captain Walsh and extract her safely if you authorize the mission." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything that everyone in the room thought they knew about the quiet fuel technician who had just claimed capabilities that would make her one of the most experienced rescue pilots in the entire military. Blackwood's expression shifted as he processed implications that went far beyond the immediate emergency, recognizing that Elena's qualifications suggested a background that was inconsistent with everything he'd been told about her identity and experience. Colonel Blackwood stood motionless for 30 seconds that felt like an eternity, his penetrating gray eyes studying Elena with the intensity of someone whose combat experience had taught him to recognize when reality didn't match appearances. The Emergency Operations Center fell silent except for the persistent radio chatter from aircraft still circling the crash site, their fuel reserves diminishing with each passing minute as weather conditions continued to deteriorate. 2,000 hours of combat rescue experience, Blackwood repeated slowly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that suggested Elena's revelation had triggered recognition rather than surprise. Ms. Martinez, there are fewer than 50 pilots in the entire United States military with that level of specialized experience. Such qualifications would make you legendary in the helicopter community. Elena felt her carefully constructed world collapsing as Blackwood's words revealed that he understood exactly what her claimed experience represented. Combat rescue pilots were elite specialists whose reputations were known throughout the aviation community, and someone with her stated qualifications wouldn't be working anonymously at a civilian airport without very specific reasons. Colonel, Elena replied, maintaining steady eye contact despite knowing that her next words would irrevocably expose her true identity. My qualifications are legitimate and verifiable through official channels. Right now, Captain Walsh needs immediate extraction, and I have the skills to reach her when conventional assets cannot. Blackwood consulted his watch while processing the tactical situation and the implications of Elena's revealed capabilities. Captain Walsh had been on the ground for over an hour in deteriorating conditions, and weather forecasts indicated that rescue windows were closing rapidly. The colonel faced a command decision that would either save a pilot's life or potentially compromise security by authorizing operations involving personnel whose backgrounds were clearly more complex than official records indicated. Major Chun, Blackwood called to the Air Force investigator who had been awakened and summoned to assist with the emergency. I need immediate verification of Ms. Martinez's claimed helicopter qualifications. Check all databases including classified personnel records. Chun approached her laptop with the urgency of someone who understood that administrative procedures were secondary to life-saving operations. But Elena knew that any database search would eventually expose the fictional nature of her Elena Martinez identity. Her legitimate qualifications existed under her real name, Captain Elena Vasquez, whose official status was killed in action 10 years earlier. Sir, Elena said, recognizing that further deception was pointless and potentially harmful to rescue operations. There are complications with my background verification that I can explain after Captain Walsh is safely extracted. Right now, she needs immediate help, and I'm the only pilot available with the necessary qualifications. Torres stepped forward to support Elena's position, his earlier exposure to her tactical expertise lending credibility to her claims. Colonel, regardless of administrative questions about Ms. Martinez's background, she's demonstrated knowledge and capabilities that could make the difference between life and death for Captain Walsh. Blackwood's radio crackled with an update that made the situation even more urgent. Command, this is Eagle 2. Weather conditions have forced us to abort. Search pattern due to insufficient visibility and dangerous wind conditions. We've lost visual contact with the pilot's beacon and cannot maintain safe operations in current weather. Elena realized that conventional rescue options had been eliminated by the same weather conditions that made her specialized mountain flying experience essential for successful extraction. Captain Walsh was now completely isolated in terrain that would be inaccessible to ground rescue teams for hours, with exposure and potential injuries creating time-critical medical concerns. Colonel Blackwood, Elena said, abandoning all pretense of maintaining her fictional identity in favor of saving a fellow pilot's life. I am Captain Elena Vasquez, formerly of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. I've been presumed dead for 10 years, but I'm qualified and ready to conduct this rescue mission immediately. The revelation hit the operations center like a physical shock wave as Elena's words revealed not just her true identity, but the impossible reality that a pilot declared killed in action was standing before them offering to save another pilot's life. Blackwood's expression shifted from suspicion to recognition as he processed the implications of Elena's statement. Ghost, Blackwood said quietly, using the call sign that had made Elena legendary throughout the special operations community. Captain Elena Vasquez, the pilot who survived 17 combat rescue missions before being killed in Afghanistan in 2015. Elena nodded while maintaining eye contact with the colonel, knowing that her reputation would either provide the credibility necessary for immediate authorization or trigger security concerns that would prevent her from conducting the rescue mission. Yes, sir, though as you can see, reports of my death were premature. Major Chun looked up from her laptop with the expression of someone whose investigation had just taken an unprecedented turn. Colonel, I'm showing classified records for Captain Elena Vasquez with the qualifications she's claimed, but official status is killed in action with body unrecovered. This is impossible. Blackwood silenced Chun with a gesture while maintaining focus on the immediate tactical situation. Elena's true identity raised profound security and administrative questions that would require extensive investigation. But Captain Walsh's life took precedence over bureaucratic concerns about presumed dead pilots who were apparently very much alive. Captain Vasquez, Blackwood said, using Elena's real rank and name for the first time in 10 years. Assume you're authorized for immediate rescue operations. Assess current conditions and provide your tactical plan for reaching Captain Walsh. Elena felt a surge of relief as Blackwood prioritized operational necessity over administrative complications, allowing her to focus on the rescue mission rather than explaining her decade-long deception. She moved to the tactical display showing weather conditions and terrain features around the crash site, her mind automatically shifting into the mission planning mode that had made her legendary among special operations aviators. Sir, current weather conditions include cloud ceiling at 800 feet with visibility less than half a mile and gusty winds up to 40 knots. Elena began, outlining the tactical situation with the professional competence that had characterized her military career. The crash site is located in a narrow valley surrounded by ridge lines that channel wind patterns and create severe turbulence. Elena used her finger to trace potential approach routes on the map display, identifying terrain, features, and weather patterns that would affect helicopter operations. Her analysis revealed intimate knowledge of mountain flying techniques and tactical decision-making that impressed even experienced military aviators in the room. The primary challenge is navigating to the crash site using instrument flight procedures, while avoiding terrain features that could create dangerous downdrafts or wind shear, Elena continued. Once there, extraction will require precision hovering in confined terrain with minimal visibility and challenging wind conditions. Blackwood studied Elena's tactical assessment while comparing it to similar analyses he'd seen from other elite pilots throughout his career. Her understanding of mountain rescue operations was comprehensive and nuanced, reflecting exactly the kind of expertise that her claimed background would provide. Captain Vasquez, Blackwood said, what aircraft do you need for this mission? And what support requirements do you have for successful completion? Elena had already identified the UH-60 Black Hawk that was parked on the flight line as the optimal aircraft for the rescue mission. The helicopter was equipped with appropriate navigation systems and rescue equipment, and she was intimately familiar with its capabilities from her years of special operations flying. Sir, the Black Hawk on the flight line is suitable for the key mission with standard rescue configuration, Elena replied. I'll need a crew chief familiar with hoist operations and medical personnel qualified for trauma care during transport. Flight time to the crash site should be approximately 20 minutes each way. Torres volunteered to serve as crew chief, his familiarity with Elena's capabilities and his experience with helicopter operations, making him an ideal choice for the mission. The base medical officer, Captain Williams, was awakened and briefed on potential injuries that Captain Walsh might have sustained during ejection and ground impact. Captain Vasquez, Blackwood said, making the formal authorization that would allow Elena to resume flying duties for the first time in 10 years. You're authorized to conduct immediate rescue operations for Captain Walsh. Mission parameters are pilot extraction with minimum risk to rescue personnel. Elena acknowledged the authorization with the professional composure that had characterized her military career, but internally she was processing the emotional impact of returning to flying duties after years of self-imposed exile from aviation. The familiar weight of responsibility for other people's lives was both terrifying and exhilarating after years of maintaining aircraft rather than flying them. As Elena conducted her pre-flight inspection of the Black Hawk, muscle memory took over from conscious thought as her hands moved through procedures she'd performed thousands of times during her active duty career. The helicopter systems were exactly as she remembered, and her confidence in her ability to conduct the rescue mission grew with each completed checklist item. "Ghost," Blackwood said privately as Elena completed her pre-flight procedures, "I need to know that you're mentally and physically ready for this mission. 10 years is a long time away from combat flying, and Captain Walsh's life depends on your current capabilities." Elena appreciated Blackwood's concern while recognizing that he was asking the same question she'd been asking herself since revealing her true identity. A decade of civilian life had changed her in ways that might affect her ability to conduct dangerous rescue operations, and the stakes were too high for false confidence or wishful thinking. "Colonel," Elena replied, "I've maintained my flight currency and physical condition specifically for situations like this. My skills may be rusty, but my judgment and experience are intact. Captain Walsh will be extracted safely." As Elena strapped herself into the pilot's seat and began starting the Black Hawk's engines, she felt the familiar vibration and sound of helicopter systems coming to life. The sensation triggered memories of countless similar missions during her active duty career, but also reminded her that this flight would mark her return to the profession she'd abandoned after losing her crew in Afghanistan. "Davis Tower, this is Rescue 1 requesting immediate departure for emergency extraction mission," Elena radioed as the helicopter lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness, proceeding direct to crash site coordinates with estimated flight time 20 minutes. The Black Hawk disappeared into the stormy night sky, carrying Elena back into the world of combat aviation she'd left behind, while those watching from the ground realized they'd just witnessed the resurrection of a legendary pilot whose return would have implications far beyond the immediate rescue mission. Captain Walsh's life hung in the balance, but so did Elena's carefully constructed decade of anonymity as Ghost prepared to reclaim her place among the elite pilots, whose skills could make the difference between life and death in impossible circumstances. The Black Hawk penetrated the storm system with Elena's hands moving across the controls with the fluid precision of someone whose muscle memory had never forgotten the intimate relationship between pilot and machine. The aircraft bucked and swayed in the turbulent air as she navigated through cloud layers that reduced visibility to mere feet, relying on instruments and terrain awareness that had been honed during years of flying in the world's most dangerous environments. "Rescue 1, this is Davis Tower," came Sarah Chun's voice through her headset, barely audible above the storm's interference. "Weather radar shows severe turbulence and wind shear in your flight path. Are you able to maintain safe flight conditions?" Elena's response was calm and professional, despite the challenging flight conditions that would have grounded most civilian pilots hours earlier. "Davis Tower, Rescue 1 is encountering moderate turbulence but maintaining controlled flight. Navigation systems are functioning normally, and I'm tracking directly to target coordinates." What Elena didn't mention was the profound emotional experience of flying again after 10 years of watching others take to the skies while she remained grounded by her own choices. Every control input, every adjustment to power and attitude, felt like reconnecting with a fundamental part of her identity that she'd buried beneath layers of civilian routine and careful anonymity. Captain Torres, serving as crew chief, monitored aircraft systems, and prepared rescue equipment with the competence of someone who understood his role in what was rapidly becoming a legendary mission. "Ma'am, hoist equipment is rigged and ready for deployment. Medical supplies are secured, and Captain Williams is prepared for patient care during transport." Elena acknowledged Torres's report while simultaneously processing weather information, terrain clearance, and navigation data that painted a picture of the most challenging rescue conditions she'd encountered since her combat deployments. The crash site was located in a narrow valley surrounded by ridge lines that created unpredictable wind patterns and limited maneuvering room for helicopter operations. "Rescue 1, this is Eagle 2, came the voice of Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, who was orbiting at higher altitude to provide radio relay and coordination support. "I have intermittent contact with Captain Walsh's survival radio. She's conscious but reporting significant pain that suggests possible spinal injuries from the ejection sequence." Elena processed Morrison's report while calculating the medical implications for her rescue approach. Spinal injuries would require extremely careful extraction procedures that minimized patient movement, but the terrain and weather conditions demanded precision flying that balanced medical concerns against flight safety requirements. As the Black Hawk approached the target area, Elena began her descent through cloud layers that obscured terrain features and created disorienting visual conditions. She transitioned to instrument flying procedures that relied on radar altimeter readings and GPS navigation to maintain safe clearance from mountains that rose invisibly around them. "Visual contact with crash site," Elena announced as she broke through the cloud layer at 600 feet above ground level. Below them, Captain Walsh's survival beacon created a small orange glow in the darkness, marking her position on a narrow ledge approximately halfway up a steep mountainside. Tactical situation was immediately apparent to Elena's experienced eye. The crash site was inaccessible to ground rescue teams and located in terrain that would challenge even the most skilled helicopter pilots. The narrow valley channeled winds into unpredictable patterns that could slam aircraft into mountainsides. Without warning, while the confined space left minimal room for maneuvering during hover operations, Torres assessed the rescue scenario and advised on hoist operations. Elena commanded while establishing a hover pattern that kept the aircraft clear of terrain while providing visual contact with Captain Walsh. "I need to know if we can maintain a stable hover position for safe extraction." Torres studied the crash site through night vision equipment while Elena fought to maintain position against wind gusts that threatened to push the Black Hawk into the mountainside. "Ma'am, the pilot appears to be on a ledge approximately 50 feet below the ridgeline. The terrain is steep and rocky with minimal clearance for aircraft positioning." Elena recognized that the rescue would require hover techniques that pushed the boundaries of helicopter performance and pilot skill. She would need to position the aircraft precisely above the crash site, while managing wind conditions that could change direction and intensity without warning, all while maintaining clearance from terrain features that were barely visible in current weather conditions. "Rescue 1, this is command," came Colonel Blackwood's voice with the authority of someone monitoring critical operations from the Emergency Coordination Center. "Weather conditions are continuing to deteriorate, with forecasts showing increased wind speeds and reduced visibility. Assess your capability to complete extraction before conditions become prohibitive." Elena evaluated the tactical situation while feeling the familiar weight of command responsibility that she'd carried during countless similar missions in Afghanistan. Captain Walsh's life depended on her ability to execute rescue procedures under conditions that were already marginal and getting worse, but aborting the mission would leave the injured pilot exposed to elements that could prove fatal. "Command, Rescue 1 is proceeding with extraction operations," Elena replied with the quiet confidence that had characterized her reputation as Ghost. "I have visual contact with the pilot and assess conditions as challenging but within operational parameters." Elena began her approach to the crash site with deliberate precision, using collective and cyclic inputs to position the Black Hawk in a hover that balanced proximity to Captain Walsh against clearance from surrounding terrain. The aircraft responded to her control inputs with the familiar sensitivity that reminded her why she'd been considered one of the military's most skilled helicopter pilots. "Hoist operations commencing," Torres announced as he prepared to lower the rescue basket toward Captain Walsh's position on the mountainside ledge. The crew chief's voice carried the tension of someone who understood that successful extraction required coordination between multiple personnel under extremely challenging conditions. Elena maintained hover position while fighting wind gusts that buffeted the aircraft and threatened to disrupt the delicate balance required for precision flying in confined spaces. Each control input was calculated to maintain aircraft position while compensating for atmospheric conditions that changed constantly as wind patterns interacted with mountainous terrain. "Visual contact with pilot," Torres reported as the rescue basket descended toward Captain Walsh's location. "She appears conscious and responsive but is having difficulty moving independently. Possible spinal injury requires careful handling during extraction procedures." Elena processed Torres's assessment while maintaining focus on aircraft control that required constant attention to wind patterns, terrain clearance, and engine performance. The Black Hawk was operating near the limits of its hover capability due to altitude and atmospheric conditions, with minimal margin for error if unexpected situations developed. "Pilot is secured in rescue basket," Torres announced after several minutes of careful maneuvering to position Captain Walsh for safe extraction. Beginning hoist operations to bring her aboard aircraft. Elena felt the aircraft's weight and balance shift as the rescue hoist lifted Captain Walsh from the mountainside toward the Black Hawk's cabin. She compensated with subtle control inputs that maintained hover position despite the dynamic loading changes that affected aircraft stability and performance characteristics. "Pilot aboard aircraft," Torres confirmed as Captain Walsh was brought into the cabin, where Captain Williams immediately began medical assessment and treatment. "Patient is conscious and responsive with complaints of back pain and possible lower extremity injuries. Vital signs are stable, and she's maintaining coherent conversation." Elena acknowledged the successful extraction while beginning her departure from the crash site, using careful flight procedures to navigate away from the mountainous terrain without encountering dangerous wind conditions or terrain features that could threaten aircraft safety. The rescue had been successful, but the return flight would require similar precision flying until they reached safer airspace. "Davis Tower, this is Rescue 1 departing crash site with pilot aboard," Elena radioed as the Black Hawk climbed away from the valley floor toward cruising altitude. "Patient is stable and receiving medical care. Estimated time of arrival 15 minutes. As Elena flew through the storm system toward Davis Regional Airport, she processed the emotional significance of having successfully completed her first rescue mission in 10 years. The familiar satisfaction of using her skills to save another pilot's life was tempered by the knowledge that her return to flying would trigger questions about her decade-long absence and the circumstances that had led to her presumed death. "Ma'am," Torres said privately through the aircraft intercom system, "that was some of the finest helicopter flying I've ever witnessed." The precision required to maintain hover position in those conditions was extraordinary. Elena appreciated Torres's professional assessment while recognizing that her performance during the rescue had demonstrated capabilities that would be impossible to explain through any background other than her true identity as Captain Elena Vasquez. The successful mission had saved Captain Walsh's life, but it had also irrevocably exposed Elena's deception and forced her to confront the consequences of revealing her survival. "Rescue 1, this is Davis Tower," came Sarah Chun's voice as the airport appeared through the storm clouds ahead of them. "Medical personnel are standing by for immediate patient transfer. Outstanding work on a successful rescue under extremely Challenging conditions. Elena began her approach to Davis Regional Airport with the knowledge that her landing would mark the end of her anonymous civilian life and the beginning of a new chapter that would require explaining 10 years of deception to military authorities who would have profound questions about her choices and motivations. Captain Walsh, despite her injuries, had remained conscious throughout the flight and was able to express her gratitude to the crew who had risked their lives to extract her from the mountainside. Her survival was a testament to Elena's skill and courage, but it was also evidence that the legendary pilot known as Ghost had never really died. She had simply been waiting for the moment when her skills would be needed to save another aviator's life. As the Black Hawk touched down at Davis Regional Airport, Elena realized that her decade of hiding was over and that she would soon face the consequences of revealing not only her survival but the exceptional capabilities that had made her a legend among special operations aviators. The rescue had been successful, but the most challenging part of her return to the aviation community was just beginning. The medical team rushed toward the Black Hawk as Elena shut down the engines, their coordinated movements illuminated by floodlights that had transformed a quiet civilian airport into an emergency medical facility. Captain Walsh was carefully transferred from the aircraft to a waiting ambulance, her condition stable but requiring immediate transport to the Regional Trauma Center for comprehensive evaluation of her ejection injuries. Elena remained in the pilot's seat for several moments after the engines wound down, absorbing the reality that her carefully guarded secret had been irrevocably exposed. The familiar post-mission routine of shutdown procedures and equipment securing felt both comforting and surreal after 10 years of watching others fly while she maintained aircraft from the ground. The weight of her true identity was no longer a burden she carried alone. It was now public knowledge that would reshape every relationship and assumption people had made about the quiet fuel technician. Colonel Blackwood approached the aircraft as Elena completed her post-flight inspection, his expression mixing professional appreciation for the successful rescue with the calculating assessment of someone whose administrative responsibilities had suddenly become extraordinarily complex. The revelation that a pilot declared killed in action 10 years ago had been working under an assumed identity at a civilian airport raised security concerns that would reverberate through multiple levels of military command. Captain Vasquez, Blackwood said, using Elena's real rank for the second time that night. Outstanding mission execution under extremely challenging conditions. Captain Walsh is alive because of your skills and courage. However, I'm sure you understand that your resurrection creates administrative complications that will require immediate attention. Elena climbed down from the aircraft with the steady composure that had characterized her military career, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether her return to the aviation community would be celebrated or investigated. Her decade of deception had been motivated by circumstances that she'd never fully explained to anyone, and those explanations would now be required by authorities who had every right to demand answers about her choices and motivations. Colonel, Elena replied, I understand the implications of revealing my identity, and I'm prepared to provide whatever explanations and cooperation are required. My priority was saving Captain Walsh's life, but I recognize that my situation raises legitimate questions about security and protocol. Major Chun had been monitoring the rescue operation from the command center, and her investigation into Elena's background had taken an unprecedented turn with the confirmation that Elena Martinez was actually Captain Elena Vasquez, a pilot whose death had been officially documented and whose survival represented an impossible contradiction to military records. Chun approached with her laptop and a stack of printed documents that would form the foundation of what promised to be an extensive investigation. Captain Vasquez, Chun began, her tone reflecting the shift from security concern to historical significance. I've pulled your complete service record from classified databases. Your reputation in the special operations community is Legendary. The missions you flew in Afghanistan saved dozens of lives and established tactical procedures that are still taught to current pilots. Elena acknowledged Qian's assessment, while recognizing that her combat record would either provide credibility for her actions or intensify scrutiny regarding her decade-long deception. The missions Chun referenced had been classified at the highest levels, involving operations that couldn't be discussed publicly but had established Elena's reputation among the select community of special operations aviators. Major Chun, Elena sighed. My service record is accurate, and I stand behind every mission I flew and every decision I made during my active duty career. My reasons for allowing people to believe I was dead are complex, but they don't diminish my commitment to aviation, safety, and protecting other pilots when circumstances require it. Torres, who had witnessed Elena's transformation from mysterious fuel technician to legendary rescue pilot, approached with the expression of someone whose understanding of reality had been fundamentally altered by the night's events. His professional respect for Elena's capabilities had evolved into awe as he processed the full implications of having worked alongside someone whose reputation was known throughout the military aviation community. Ma'am, Torres said, I've been in aviation for 15 years, and what you accomplished tonight was the finest example of helicopter flying I've ever witnessed. The precision required to maintain hover position in those conditions was something I thought existed only in training manuals and war stories. Elena appreciated Torres's professional assessment while understanding that his praise would contribute to the growing recognition that her capabilities far exceeded anything that could be explained through conventional backgrounds. The successful rescue had demonstrated skills that were possessed by fewer than a dozen pilots in the entire military, and such expertise would inevitably attract attention from the highest levels of command. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison arrived at the aircraft as Elena secured the final equipment items, his expression mixing professional admiration with personal curiosity about the woman who had just revealed herself to be one of the most skilled pilots he'd ever encountered. Morrison's own extensive flying experience gave him the expertise to fully appreciate the level of skill required for the rescue mission Elena had just completed. Captain Vasquez, Morrison said, I flew with some exceptional pilots during my career, but what you did tonight was extraordinary. The tactical decision-making, precision flying, and risk management demonstrated capabilities that define the very best of military aviation. Elena recognized that Morrison's praise was both personally gratifying and professionally dangerous, as his testimony would contribute to investigations that would examine every aspect of her background and motivations. The successful rescue had saved Captain Walsh's life, but it had also created a spotlight that would illuminate aspects of her past that she'd worked for 10 years to keep hidden. Colonel Morrison, Elena replied, the rescue was successful because of exceptional crew coordination and favorable circumstances. Captain Walsh's survival is what matters, not the techniques required to achieve that outcome. As the immediate post-mission activities concluded and medical personnel confirmed that Captain Walsh was en route to definitive care, Elena found herself facing the administrative reckoning that she'd been dreading since revealing her true identity. Colonel Blackwood had been in contact with higher authorities throughout the rescue mission, and those conversations had resulted in instructions that would determine Elena's immediate future. Captain Vasquez, Blackwood announced, I've received direction from Air Force personnel, command regarding your status and the investigation that will be required to address your unique circumstances. You're to remain at this facility pending arrival of investigators who will conduct comprehensive interviews regarding your survival and subsequent activities. Elena had expected such restrictions, knowing that her decade of deception would require extensive investigation before authorities could determine whether her actions had compromised security or violated military regulations. The investigation would examine everything from her initial survival to her decision to assume a false identity, and those inquiries would inevitably expose circumstances that she'd never discussed with anyone. "Sir," Elena replied, "I understand the necessity for investigation, and I'll provide complete cooperation with any inquiries. I want to emphasize that my actions were never intended to compromise security or deceive military authorities for personal gain." Major Chun consulted her notes while preparing for what would be the beginning of an extensive investigation into one of the most unusual cases in military aviation history. The discovery that a pilot declared killed in action had been alive and working under an assumed identity for 10 years would require careful examination of security protocols, administrative procedures, and the circumstances that had led to Elena's presumed death. "Captain Vasquez," Chun said, "the initial phase of our investigation will focus on verifying your survival and documenting the circumstances that led to your decision to remain officially dead. This process will require detailed interviews and examination of evidence related to your original crash and subsequent activities." Elena recognized that Chun's investigation would eventually expose the classified mission that had resulted in her crew's death and her own decision to disappear rather than return to military service. Those circumstances involved political and operational factors that couldn't be discussed publicly, but would be crucial for understanding her motivations and assessing any security implications of her decade-long deception. "Major Chun," Elena said, "I'm prepared to provide complete information about my survival and subsequent decisions, but some aspects of my original mission remain classified and will require appropriate security procedures for discussion." As dawn broke over the Nevada desert, Elena stood beside the Black Hawk that had carried her back into the world of military aviation, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and red that reminded her of similar mornings in Afghanistan, when successful missions had meant that everyone came home alive. The rescue of Captain Walsh had been successful, but it had also marked the end of Elena Martinez and the resurrection of Captain Elena Vasquez, a pilot whose return would have implications far beyond the immediate emergency that had forced her to reveal her survival. The next several hours would bring investigators, interviews, and administrative procedures that would determine whether Elena's decade of deception would be viewed as a security violation or as the understandable response of someone who had survived trauma that officially killed her. Captain Walsh was alive because Elena had chosen to reveal her true identity when circumstances demanded it, and that successful rescue would either vindicate her choices or serve as evidence that her skills had been wasted during years of anonymous civilian employment. Airport manager Janet Williams approached Elena with the expression of someone whose understanding of her employee had been completely transformed by the night's revelations. "Captain Vasquez," Williams said, "I want you to know that regardless of what happens with military investigations, you'll always have a place here at Davis Regional. What you did tonight saved a pilot's life and demonstrated the kind of professionalism that defines the best of aviation." Elena appreciated Williams's support while recognizing that her future employment options would be determined by military authorities who would assess whether her skills could be better utilized in official capacity rather than civilian disguise. The successful rescue had proven that her capabilities remained intact after 10 years away from military flying, and those demonstrated skills would inevitably attract offers to return to active duty in various capacities. As the investigation team prepared to arrive and begin their comprehensive examination of Elena's background and motivations, she reflected on the choices that had led to this moment. 10 years ago, she had chosen to let Captain Elena Vasquez die rather than face the consequences of decisions that had cost her crew their lives. Tonight, she had chosen to resurrect Ghost in order to save Captain Walsh, accepting that her decade of anonymity would end but that another pilot would live because of her skills and courage, the quiet fuel technician who had watched others fly, while she remained grounded, was gone forever, replaced by the legendary pilot whose return would either be celebrated as a miraculous resurrection or investigated as a decade-long deception. Either way, Captain Elena Vasquez was back, and the aviation community would never be quite the same. 6 months later, Captain Elena "Ghost" Vasquez stood in the briefing room at Davis Regional Airport, now designated as the Western Regional Search and Rescue Training Center. The walls displayed photos of successful rescue missions, including the dramatic night extraction that had ended her decade of hiding. Captain Walsh, fully recovered from her injuries, served as her deputy commander. Today's exercise will demonstrate advanced mountain rescue techniques, Elena announced to a room filled with military and civilian pilots eager to learn from the legend herself. Remember, the aircraft doesn't care about your rank or reputation only. Your skill and judgment matter when lives are on the line. Colonel Blackwood, now a close ally and supporter, had worked through the bureaucratic maze to grant Elena a special commission that allowed her to train the next generation of rescue pilots while maintaining her civilian status. The investigation into her decade-long disappearance had been quietly classified, with authorities recognizing that her skills were too valuable to lose to administrative punishment. Major Chun, who had become Elena's official liaison with military intelligence, approached with the latest assignment. "We have 3 pilots trapped in Alaska. Weather conditions are extreme. Terrain is impossible. Standard rescue assets can't reach them." Elena studied the mission parameters, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with impossible. "Rescues, prep the Black Hawk, the Ghost is going hunting." As she walked toward the flight line, Elena reflected on how saving one pilot had led to saving dozens more. Sometimes the greatest legends aren't born from glory, but from the quiet courage to step forward when others need help. What did you think of Elena's incredible journey from hiding to heroism? Stories like these remind us that extraordinary people often walk among us in ordinary disguise. If you enjoyed this tale of courage and redemption, hit that subscribe button and join our community for more inspiring stories that celebrate the unsung heroes around us. What amazing story should we tell next?